further on behalf of the defendant. Thank you, Detective Weaver.
Any further evidence? Reflect who's absent. Court, any motions on behalf of the defendant?
Yes, Your Honor. For the record, I would make the motion that the defense moves at this point in time to dismiss the charge of first-degree murder on the grounds that the evidence is insufficient as a matter of law on every element of each charge to support a submission to the charge to the jury, and that the submission of the to the jury would therefore violate the 14th Amendment. Your Honor, and just note it's unlike the most favorable to the state at this point in time, but I think the text messages seem to indicate that Miss Madonna was going forward of asking Jose to leave the house and for the separation, nothing to indicate any kind of premeditation and deliberate act on behalf of on her part. So therefore, we would move to dismiss this charge. We don't need to be heard any further.
Thanks, sir. Denied.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Defendant going to present evidence?
Yes, Your Honor, we will.
Okay, you can bring the jury in.
Oh, Your Honor, can I have 1 second before we bring the jury in there? Yes. On the 5th floor? So.
Going to testify?
Your Honor, at this point in time, we believe the defendant will testify, but not at this as this witness.
Evidence on behalf of the defendant.
Yes, Your Honor. At this point, we would call Dr. Sandra Zinn.
Place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. Please stand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, ma'am. Have a seat, please.
Witness with you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Zinn.
Good afternoon.
Can you tell us a little bit about your educational background, please?
I have a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill.
And how are you currently employed?
I'm employed as a clinical psychologist by the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Have you always done that in your professional career?
Yes.
Are you involved in any professional associations?
I am a member of the International Neuropsychological Society.
And tell us about your work with the VA.
I serve in several capacities at the VA Medical Center. I work as a clinical psychologist doing psychotherapy at the Raleigh Outpatient Clinic. I also work as a neuropsychologist doing brain damage assessments. And I serve as the chair of the Human Research Ethics Board for the Maine Medical Center. We review all of the clinical research done by the VA for ethical propriety.
Doctor, tell us about any honors that you've received over the course of your career.
When I first started at the VA, I was granted a research fellowship, and I did alcohol recovery and stroke research, and then I received a career development award from the VA, which was for 6 years of funding by the government to pursue my research.
At this point, we would tender Dr. Zinn as an expert in psychology.
Any objection?
No objection.
So received.
Dr. Zinn, did you come to encounter Jose Perez as a patient at some point?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Tell us about how you started to see Mr. Perez in terms of treatment. When was that?
It was in early 2009, I believe in January of 2009. He had been referred by his primary care physician.
And who would have that been, if you recall?
That would have been Bob Falge.
And after that referral, did you meet with Mr. Perez?
I did. I met with him for a 1-hour intake appointment, which is usually when we evaluate what the client, what their needs are, and make some recommendations. And then I met with him again on, 6 to 8 other occasions.
But that first meeting was January 21st, 2009?
Yes, ma'am.
And are you involved in any way in the intake process before they get to you, before a patient gets to you?
No.
So in 2009, he'd been referred by his primary care physician, Dr. Falge, to see you.
Yes.
What were some of the concerns that he had come to see you about?
His primary concern, he was very distressed that day because he and his girlfriend, who was Ms. Madonna, had had a fight that morning, and he was upset that he might have lost her.
Did he indicate why he thought he might have lost her?
To the best of my recollection, he was concerned that he had been misrepresenting his financial state, and when she found out that he had less money than she thought, or that he had borrowed money from some friends, then she was upset and told him to leave.
Did he talk to you about how his deceitfulness, lying about these issues, was affecting the relationship?
That was a concern, yes.
And what did he tell you about that?
It is hard for me to, of course, recall exactly what he might have said. This was many years ago, but according to my notes, he said that, he had a problem with lying, and that he had lied about some money, and that he was afraid that that had destroyed the relationship.
And in the course of lying about his finances, did he indicate to you that he borrowed money from other people?
That's what I recall, yes.
And he indicated to you that Miss Madonna's reaction was not good to this news, right?
That is correct.
What were his concerns that she might do as a result of learning about this lying?
From my notes, it appeared that she had already told him to leave, and he was needing to find another place to stay, so he certainly felt that she had rejected him on account of this lying.
And did he indicate to you at that point how long they had been in a dating relationship?
To the best of my recollection, I think they had been dating about 6 months at that time.
And doctor, do you have your notes with you here today?
I do.
If you need to refer to them, that's fine.
Okay.
It's a lot of information to try to remember offhand. But during that first session on January 21st, basically, he talked about the financial stress that was put on the marriage due to his lying.
Yes.
And-
Well, actually, I don't know that the financial stress was created by the lying, but there was stress.
But those were issues you talked about in the session.
Mm-hmm.
Did he stay for that full first interview?
No, he left early.
Why was that?
I can't say for sure, but that basically, because he had been, as he thought, kicked out, then he had to go do something.
Do you know if Mr. Perez and Miss Madonna were living together at the time?
I believe so.
Did he indicate to you at all during that first session how long that there had been problems in the relationship? Or if there had been problems up in the relationship up until that point?
I'm sure he did. I don't recall for sure. Would you like for me to check my notes
If you
on
don't
that?
mind, doctor.
So yes, he said that it had been a problem for actually longer than they had been living together.
Did he indicate how long, if at all?
And my note says about 8 to 11 months.
Do you know if prior to that January 21st date, if he had sought any treatment before through the VA?
He had not sought mental health treatment before, no.
Do you know if that's just through you or anybody else at the VA?
He was, before he came to the Durham VA, he was previously seen down at the North Florida VA, and there were no mental health records from his time there.
And just for some clarification, Dr. Zinn, where is the Durham VA? Where is it located?
The VA Medical Center itself is located in Durham. I saw Mr. Perez at the Raleigh clinic that's over on Sunnybrook Road.
And then, after that January 21st visit, was there kind of a lapse in treatment?
There was.
Had you scheduled an appointment for him to come back?
I had.
What happened with that, if you know?
I don't recall. I presume he did not show up, but he did come back later.
And would have that next visit been on June the 16th, 2009?
According to my notes, yes.
And on June the 16th, 2009, what did you discuss in that therapy session?
Very similar issues to our first session.
Can you tell us a little more detail about what you talked about?
Well, he had told me his story about what had happened with the money, and he presented it to me as if he had been trying to raise money but just hadn't been able to. Various things had fallen through, and then...
I'm sorry, doctor. What specifically did he tell you had fallen through?
He had hoped to get money from his mother's inheritance, and then he was also going to sell some property in Puerto Rico.
And he told you that those things fell through.
Yes, he did.
What else did you discuss during that session?
We also discussed his relationship with Ms. Madonna.
What kind of things did you talk about?
Well, he told me how they had met, and
How was that?
they had met through AA. And that they were living together, I think, in her father's home, but they were getting ready to move out into a place of their own. He also talked a little bit about some of the characteristics of their relationship and different things that went on between them.
What did he talk about in terms of that?
As far as specific incidents, I didn't note those down, but in my notes, what I did note was that there were a number of times where he might disagree with the way she was doing something or with different decisions that she was making, but he had great difficulty bringing himself to talk to her about that.
What was your observations on that visit, if you made any in your notes?
My sense was that that this was not the most peaceful and stable relationship, not in terms of physical violence of any kind, but just that there was a considerable amount of emotional turmoil between the two of them.
I believe you noted that they were likely codependent on each other.
Yes.
Explain that to the jury. What does that mean?
Codependence is a semi-technical, semi-popularized term, and it means when two people are in a relationship that they become very emotionally dependent upon one another, that any statements, actions made by one really affects the other person, and they take the slightest little movements in terms of emotion, feeling, thought, statements very, very seriously. So it is, codependency is when people don't have what we would consider more healthy interpersonal boundaries, where if someone says no, you can say, okay, they're saying no. If someone says no to you and you're in a codependent relationship, then this is seen as a very serious threat to your own well-being.
Did you also note in your report that the possibility of the relationship ending was a concern for him still?
Yes, it was.
If you recall, can you discuss that any further?
Well, I believe that Mr. Perez was consistently worried about being rejected and about losing his connection with Miss Madonna. He was afraid that anything he said or did might provoke her, and then he would be out on his ear, so to speak.
But he became panicked if and when he thought the relationship might end?
Yes, he did.
And your next visit with him would have been July 17th, is that correct, of 2009?
Yes, ma'am.
What do you recall about that session?
I believe that they had rented a home together, they had settled in, and he, at least for that time, seemed to feel pretty good about things. Although he was concerned that she would leave on shopping trips, he wasn't sure if that was really the case, or at least that's what I was kind of assuming, that he worried about where she might be if she was away from him. And he also, again, had issues that he was concerned about, but because of his fear of rejection, he was not bringing these up with her.
Is it fair to say a lot of trust issues that were discussed
Yes.
in that session? And just to backtrack for a second, Doctor, the visit before that, on June 16th, did he indicate to you at that time that he was getting some maybe conflicting messages from Miss Madonna?
Yes, he talked about that, that sometimes she would tell him that they were just friends, but then she would also ask to be cuddled in bed, so that he was getting kind of mixed emotional messages about his place in the relationship.
And that was June 16th, 2009, correct?
Yes,
That was before they were married, do you know?
it was before they were married.
And then I believe the next visit was a joint session, is that correct, on August 18th?
Repeat the question.
The next section would have been on August 18th of 2009, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was a joint session, meaning that
Yes, Miss Madonna came as well.
accompanied Mr. Perez. What was discussed during that session?
Well, they discussed his lying, their trust issues, and what he was willing to do about it.
And what was he willing to do?
Well, he was very committed. He said he was committed to working on these issues, and we discussed some of their dynamics and more general kinds of things that they could do to improve their relationship.
And at that point, do you know if it was still their intent to remain together and work on these issues?
They intended to and told me that they were planning to get married.
I believe the next session would have been October 28, 2009, and that was just Mr. Perez for an individual session,
Yes.
correct?
Mm-hmm.
What was discussed during that session?
This was a continuation of some of the concerns that he had about things that went on in their household. He was concerned about that he felt her youngest daughter could manipulate her, and he wanted her to be more firm. And they were also having financial issues. One of the clear problems was that, again, he had great difficulty being assertive, that he would talk to me about things that were concerns, but he didn't feel safe bringing them up with her.
And he told you at that point that finances were still an issue in the relationship, correct?
Yes.
And I believe the next session would have been November 16th, 2009.
Yes, ma'am.
And what was discussed during that session?
They also, again, talked about,
Now, this was a joint session?
This
No.
was an individual session.
this was
I
another
believe.
individual session, sir.
I believe, Doctor, there was only 2 joint sessions in the whole over the
That's
course
correct.
of the treatment, right? One we've already discussed and one we'll get to.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, these sessions were geared towards Jose, correct? And
Yes.
because he sought out this treatment with the recommendation of his primary care physician to get treatment for the issues that you guys were discussing.
Yes.
So at that individual session in November 16th, 2009, what was discussed?
Again, he talked about issues with being a step-parent and how she related to her own children, how he felt about that. He also had a son who was blind, who had just moved in with them, and this was another source of conflict and distress. So he mentioned that he talked to his AA sponsor, who would try to help him focus on what he could do and what he couldn't do, and that was certainly something that we worked on as well.
Did he give you any further details about his son staying with them in the home at that point? Did he indicate whether or not one of the stressors was his son needed a lot of care?
Yes.
And that was a hardship on both him and Joanna because his son was quite ill.
Yes.
Do you recall anything specific about that?
Just that his idea was that the son was with them temporarily, but he also found it very overwhelming to care for him.
Do you know how long his son ended up staying in the home? And you may not know. But
I'm not sure, no.
Did he also indicate to you at that session that they were looking to get a new home?
Yes.
Did he tell you anything about that?
That they were already, I presume, in the process of buying a house, and were going to be moving in March of 2010.
I believe the next session, Doctor, would have been on December 18th. And again, that was just an individual session with Jose, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Tell us about that session.
He reported that his ex-wife was suing him for alimony. However, he wasn't too worried about this because he was typically financially generous with her, had helped her out of some tight spots, and so he didn't feel that he would be required to pay alimony. And his son, at this point in time, was in the hospital, clearly having some major health problems. So he, at that point in time, felt like their relationship was going reasonably well. Again, there were concerns such as a step-parent would have about how she was relating to her daughters.
And just so we're clear, the ex-wife he was talking about wasn't Miss Madonna's current wife or girlfriend at that time. That was a previous relationship.
That was his previous wife, yes.
And he indicated to you that he had helped her out financially a lot,
Yes.
even after their separation.
That's what I assumed.
And I believe you said that towards the end, that Jose, Mr. Perez's son, was still in the home at that time as well.
Yes.
They were trying to make other arrangements for him, but at that point he was still in the home. He indicated to you at that time things in the relationship were doing better, were going well.
That's what I had put in my notes, yes.
Doctor, the next session, I believe, would be the second joint session that was done between Mr. Perez and Ms. Madonna. That was on January 29th.
Yes, ma'am.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, apparently his son was still living with them. They were experiencing a fair amount of stress from trying to meet his needs. They had identified an older couple who was going to help care for his son. And so they were hoping that this would make things better. They continued to have issues with making decisions as a couple versus one of them making a decision and the other one then being frustrated about it, and we talked about that.
So you talked on ways that they could both improve their communication?
Yes.
And did they both seem receptive to that?
I could only speculate on that from this point in time.
But they were both there in the session, right?
And they agreed to do that.
I believe June 1st, 2010 would have been the next session. Is that accurate? And again, I believe this time it's just Mr. Perez that had come in.
Yes, ma'am.
What can you tell us about that session?
This time he had health concerns as well. He had been scheduled for a colonoscopy, was having bloody bowel movements. He was worried about what this might mean. And again, continued issues with parenting and money management in the marriage.
And I believe that was your last session, correct?
Yes, it was.
So was that, I think my math's right, 7 individual sessions with Mr. Perez and then the 2 marital sessions?
Correct.
And that would be the only sessions that you conducted over the course of your treating Mr. Perez and meeting with Ms. Madonna, right?
Yes.
In dealing overall with them over the course of that treatment, was it your assessment, or what was your assessment of Mr. Perez and him dealing with issues that were going on in the marriage? He
had a rather passive dependent style of dealing with issues. He was afraid to assert himself, and that was something that I had worked on with him as his therapist.
I think in some term you labeled it a runner.
Yes.
Just describe that a little, what you meant by a runner.
He was someone who preferred to avoid confrontation, if at all possible. He had mentioned on several occasions that he kept his suitcase packed. It was a case of, well, I'm going to leave before you dump me. And I think that he would become very anxious if there was some kind of conflict or if there was a threat of loss of the relationship.
That was a continuing issue in your therapy with him, that he did not want to lose the relationship he had with Miss Madonna, correct?
Yes.
Are you aware of any of the medications that he was on at the time that might have been not prescribed by yourself, but Dr. Falge? And you might not be, I'm just asking.
I'm not truly aware. I mean, I know of some of the medical issues that he had, and I can have some idea of what
You didn't
medications.
prescribe him any medications in
No.
terms of your treatment?
You got much?
A few questions. Might be more than 10 minutes. But I'll
Okay.
try.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to take our evening recess at this point. During this time, it's your duty not to talk among yourselves about this case. It's your duty not to talk to the parties, the witnesses, or the lawyers about anything at all. It's your further duty not to talk to anyone else, to allow anyone else to talk with you, to say anything in your presence about this case. Avoid reading, watching, listening to any accounts of this trial if there are any. Don't do any individual research or investigation on your own about any issue touching on this trial. If you get exposed to any information about this case in any way, let the sheriff know about it and come in tomorrow morning. And do not form or express any opinion about this case during this time. With that, while everyone else will remain seated, I'll excuse the 13 of you and ask that you return and assemble in the jury room tomorrow morning at 9:30. That's your excuse.